Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, Bigger Than Marketing, How Social Insights Can Revolutionize Customer Experience. Your host today is Brandwatch's CMO, Will McInnes.
Hello.
And we're joined by guest speaker Corey Munchback, analyst at Forrester Research.
Good afternoon. Good morning.
We would love your participation today, so if you have any questions, you can reach us in a few different ways. You can tweet us at Brandwatch using the hashtag BrandwatchTips, or you can ask questions in the session chat, and we will be doing a Q&A at the end of the session, so we will get to your questions then, and if for some reason we can't get to all of them, we will follow up with you afterward. We will be recording today's session, and we will make that recording available to you along with the slides within a couple of days after this. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Corey.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here and joining you this afternoon, Will and Drew. I'm excited about this topic, customer experience and social marketing. So we're going to jump right in here, and I think we'll have some time for questions at the end if anyone has them. But what you see on your screen right now is probably familiar, maybe not visually, but conceptually to anyone who attended business school. You probably know Michael Porter's 5 Forces of Competitive Advantage. And I want to start here as sort of an illustration of where we are in the market today, whether you are a marketer or just someone working in business trying to better understand and engage with your customers or your consumers. We see that the 5 kind of key areas that Michael Porter identified as sources for companies to gain competitive advantage over the last 20 or 30 years or so have essentially gone away as a result of technology empowering consumers with more information, better alternatives, and more freedom to choose and engage with the brands, the products, and the just institutions really outside of just formal businesses that they choose to. So for example, you see here in the top right corner that you have the potential entrants, that barriers to entry are much lower than they ever used to be. So your customers have options from everywhere, companies big and small, as more players can enter a given market. So I think a great example of this that we've seen recently is anyone who's familiar perhaps with the Dollar Shave Club, which is a small company. They basically started with advertising on YouTube and have grown to take a pretty significant market share out of more established companies such as Gillette, who even went so far as in their earnings report at the end of last year to try to diffuse the fact that their earnings had gone down by blaming it on a phenomenon called Movember, which is just when guys didn't shave for a month. So clearly sort of missing that there's something more fundamental going on, that even really entrenched companies that have had access to their own manufacturing and advertising dollars through the roof are still able to be threatened by very small startups in hard goods, not just on digital platforms. You also see that the power of buyers has gone up, that technology empowers buyers with their digital tools to make themselves smarter. So they may have even more information about your products and your services than you do. And as a result, they have bargaining leverage that, in fact, Porter even predicted would come from having more information at their fingertips. We also see from a threat of substitutes that channels and products that are alternatives are undercutting profits. And this is most obvious and has been for some time, where digital options have gutted existing markets and their revenue streams, which started in media but is increasingly going into retail now. Another company that had to declare some serious difficulty with their business model at the end of last year was Weight Watchers, because people are turning to options such as Lose It, MyFitnessPal, and other apps and online communities that are free or much cheaper than the Weight Watchers alternative and getting the same experience and the same results. The other one here on the lower left is the power of suppliers, that people are a key supply element today, that employees essentially have more power over companies than ever before. And this is sort of the knowledge economy at the greatest height that it's ever been. So for anyone who remembers, about a year ago now, a 17-year-old in the UK named Nick Deloisio, whose app was purchased by Yahoo for estimates of around $17 million. And he came with his app to Yahoo. So it wasn't just as much his just IP, but his ideas that were also so valuable. And what this means for companies is that your killer salesperson or your agency strategist owns a relationship that builds the competitive advantage with the customer. And you have to hold tight onto those people or they're going to take your clients with you wherever they go. And then lastly, this upper left here, you have industry competitors, that competition is fiercer in every way, shape, and form. So that your competition has a window, essentially, into your business. So your chatty customers are sharing information with your competitors, which makes the competitive landscape that much more intense and dynamic. And this initially and most prevalently has happened as a result of the groundswell of social media and the conversations and all the different channels that customers have to talk about and share information with one another. So we look here what this has meant for the business and for the kind of broader business environment that we're dealing with here, is that we're in now, what you'll see on the next slide here, is the age of the customer, where your only source of competitive advantage is the relationship that you have with your customer. So what we've seen since 2010 is sort of where this has taken real root. But prior to that, over the century or so previously, that companies were able to fixate on either a manufacturing advantage in the early part of the century, then into distribution channels and being able to monopolize distribution as a way of staying ahead of the competition. And then even in the 90s, with the age of information, that supply chains, the internet, the rise of that meant that the companies that were controlling information were much more successful. But now, since customers and their demand essentially leads to who has control over manufacturing, distribution, and information, that brings us to where we are today, where those empowered buyers are demanding a new level of customer obsession. And you'll see here on this slide now how we define customer obsession, that this is not just my company is customer focused or my company is customer centric, but rather that a customer obsessed enterprise focuses its strategy, its energy, and its budget on processes that enhance the knowledge of and engagement with customers and prioritizes these over maintaining traditional competitive barriers. And what that looks like will vary from company to company. But as you can see here, that this is a fundamental shift in how a company operates, how a company thinks about itself and the products and services that it provides, thinks about them completely relevant to the customer. So we move forward here to kind of see what that can mean in terms of real budget changes, is that there are really strategic imperatives that a customer-obsessed enterprise has. And one of those is that you shift spending from general to contextualized customer experiences. So what this means is that you spend less, if you build this out well, if you spend less on things like personalization that doesn't have specific customer value attached to it, or mass emails with very limited degree of customization involved in them, or in flexible content management systems. But you're spending more, on the other hand, on experience maps that help identify point-in-time relevance. So you find touch-point specific behavior analysis. And what this is really implying is not just that you're spending more on these things, but that it's also translating into really specific process changes, how you go to market, how you plan your business. All of this will be impacted depending on how you make these shifts in budget and what you choose to invest your time and your money in. We can see that the implications of this are fairly significant. And one of the ways that we have thought about sort of how this customer-obsessed enterprise will look is that the customer experience discipline subsumes marketing. What this means, I'm going to break this down a little bit because there's a couple dimensions here. But the first is that there is a clear tension that's building between marketing and customer experience right now. And we think that that results in a customer experience sort of winner, which is not to say that marketing goes away, that they will still be part of the whole effort. They're an important process. But that our marketing ultimately has to take orders from the customer experience leaders in order to do their job right in a customer-obsessed world. And finally, what that means, or the third pillar of this, is that CMOs who are actually given the opportunity, and marketers more generally who are given an opportunity to become part of the customer experience role and lead brand and customer experience together, will be the ones who succeed. It's those marketers who don't understand sort of how this dynamic connects, how these things play together, that are going to be out of a job at the end of the day. because we see so clearly the value that customer experience brings to the organization and how marketing can contribute to that. Marketing, quite honestly, is pretending to be customer obsessed. So I talk to a lot of marketers day in and day out who are talking about sort of how they're focused on the customer, but it's a little bit of a false pretense right now, and I'll show you why. There's a couple of different elements here that are at play. So the first is that CMOs that we talk to continue to prioritize acquisition over retention. So we see that 63% of CMOs who are asked about their most important strategic priorities say that customer acquisition is their most important priority. Only 22% of those CMOs say that retention was a top priority for them. So it is a gaping chasm between sort of talking about how important loyalty is and retaining customers from what they're actually making a priority. The next element sort of identifies marketing's false pretenses here is that only 8% of marketers are using needs-based personas. So in other words, they're thinking about their customers in pretty static, flat terms. So they're using demographics, maybe some purchase history, and a couple of other kind of standard components to understanding who their customer is, but they're not thinking about the customer in terms of her needs. What is it that she is looking for, what motivates her, and getting a much clearer sort of emotional and behavioral understanding. That is something that most marketers have not come anywhere close to doing, despite being a much better way to emotionally connect and sort of prioritize that knowledge of an enhancement with the customer that we talked about as being a hallmark of the customer-obsessed organization. And then lastly, we see here that there's a big gap between the tools, again, that segmentation studies, which are those more static, kind of based on demographics and sort of standard behaviors, are far more used than things like customer lifetime value in terms of what's driving the market. So you may have the marketing efforts that are focused on those customer segments, but they don't layer in much more important information such as lifetime value to really get a clear picture of who you're targeting, why you're targeting, et cetera. And so this is a big, again, sort of call out to marketing to stop pretending to do this and really start to show us where your priorities are changing to reflect this sort of new paradigm that you're in. We see that in order to do this successfully, that customer experience and marketing need to move in the same direction. So we've seen the sort of the two key tools that marketing and customer experience use to understand themselves don't align. So you can see here on the next slide how we've kind of factored those in. So customer experience totally lacks a grounding. So you can see here that when we ask them what sets the customer experience strategy at their company, it's all over the place. There's nothing there's a 25% who say that it stands entirely on its own. Only 18% say that the strategy is connected to brand, and then another 21% say that it's a separate corporate strategy. So you can see here that, marketing, which sort of naturally has a home, everyone sort of knows where it lives, doesn't have that same resonance when it comes to customer experience. And you'll see on the next slide that as well, the responsibility for customer experience, or the top-down view, is very fragmented. So while 27% of companies have customer experience within the marketing group, that's only a quarter. And you can see the disparate ways that customer experience fits into the organization. Maybe in a line of business, it may be directly into the CEO. But again, the fragmentation happening here makes it very difficult to sort of identify where customer experience should live, where it does live, and how to make those connections more clear. The other challenge that we see is goals and measurement are very disconnected between customer experience and marketing. So on the left, this is what we call our customer experience triangle, where we identify the three kind of elements that a customer experience should have. It should meet the person's needs, it should be easy, and ideally also it should be enjoyable. So those are sort of the three layers of a customer experience. On the flip side, you have marketing with its traditional funnel that's focused on making people aware, sort of pushing them through, and perhaps considering loyalty at the other end. But you can see how these two frameworks, as a core component of how these two groups of professionals get work done, there's no overlap here, no natural sort of synthesis between these two that can really be capitalized on.
So jumping in here, speaking both as a marketer and as a spokesperson for Brandwatch, I think this is a really, really interesting time A time for us, both as marketers and as people interested in social media and social analytics, because essentially what we can layer on top of what Corey's run through is that organizations are experiencing this increasingly loud and confident voice from the social web, which is the aggregate of hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of consumers who can relay and voice their experiences as customers. And that's a really interesting dynamic. I have recently moved to a place called Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and I love burgers. And to me, there is only one way to find the very best burger. And it is, of course, using things like Yelp and Seamless. And it's been a really interesting kind of customer experience journey, if you like, because there I am, I'm in the market, I've got the budget, I've got the need, the desire, the interest, and I look to the experiences of others to help inform my decision. Increasingly also, we know that on places like LinkedIn, there are these endorsements. So increasingly, not only is it burgers and sneakers and landlords and all kinds of products and services that are being rated, but we as professionals increasingly are being rated. So it's a really interesting kind of time to be thinking about customer experience, which is this kind of great enlightenment where we're all connecting up and joining up our experiences to help others make smarter decisions. And if you look at what people say about popular brands, take JetBlue for example, it's not uncommon to find a huge proportion of what happens on social is actually about the customer experience. So it's not necessarily about the marketing. A good proportion of these tweets here, for example, are about the actual product and the experience of the product and how that felt and what the consequences were. And so this is why we wanted to work together with Corey on this angle here, is because we think that so much of what happens with social intelligence is oriented in a really hardcore way to marketing and PR. And in fact, we recently, just around Christmas time, did a customer survey. We asked our customers, amongst many other things, how do they use Brandwatch? What is the primary use case or primary use cases that they use Brandwatch for? And I'm sure this would map to some degree or other to our peers and competitors. And what it really says to me is you can see that the major use cases are the brand and reputation management. So whether that's marketing or PR, you've got crisis in there, you've got campaigns in there, community management. And a lot of these overlap, and for me, a lot of these fall under the broad domain of marketing. If we put our customer experience hats on, then perhaps we might count those people using Brandwatch for market research, or we might count those looking at customer services, and perhaps there are some buried in other. But for me, what it really helped me think was that there's a bigger opportunity here. There's a bigger opportunity to pair the big picture that Corey's talked about with the insights that we can get from social to really learn more about our customer experience. And I think if we can do that well, then there are 2 or 3 really nice benefits available to us as marketers, as customer experience people, wherever we sit in that fragmented, slightly dislocated areas of responsibility that Corey mentioned. I love this quote from the Yahoo CEO, Marissa Mayer, which goes along the lines of, if you've got the data, great, let's look at it. But if we're going on opinion, then let's go with mine. And what that really says for me is something about the ferocity of being data-oriented, and also the opportunity of being data-oriented. When we think about customer experience, there is this huge benefit to use social insights and social intelligence to look at the social web as a great source of unprompted data. So this is available information for us which can help us understand how our customer experience is performing, and a necessary step in order to understand how we can improve it. The great thing about social data is it's live and dynamic, but it's unprompted, and we know from a market research point of view that makes it in some ways more credible, and that comes with lots of caveats, but essentially it is unprompted, which is a useful aspect for us to recognize. Secondly, there's something about the social insights that we can get for our customer experience interest about speed. I love this model. It's called the OODA loop, which, apart from sounding like a fantastic kind of Scandinavian word, was derived from a model designed by a guy called John Boyd, who is an ex-US fighter pilot. And what John Boyd realized was that when you're flying fighter jets, essentially the quicker you can move through this loop, the more likely you are to live or die. So pretty high stakes, not stakes that we're commonly confronted with in marketing or customer experience. But essentially what Boyd is saying is the quicker that a player in a game can observe what's happening, can orient themselves within that environment, decide what to do and act, and then continually go back and forth through that loop, the more likely they are to thrive. And how this relates to customer experience for us at Brandwatch is that it's about the speed of social insights and how quickly we can understand what consumers' customer experience is. There is a pace now to the world that we're operating in. Corey mentioned it earlier about real time. And this speed is potentially very advantageous to us. We can more quickly find out whether this new distribution channel, this new product experience, this new flavor is working well and resounding with our customers. And the third kind of consequence or benefit, I think, of all of this is that it's potentially therefore cheaper. And it shouldn't necessarily be seen as a complete alternative to traditional methods for understanding customer experience. I think that would be silly. But what would be smart would be to compare and to augment and to enrich our classical understanding of customer experience with faster, unprompted insights, which are cheaper as well. So by taking out the kind of traditional mechanisms, we can in some cases lower the cost of this kind of research. So platforms like Brandwatch can access and filter and segment conversations at scale, which help us quickly understand what customers' experience is. So handing back to Corey.
Great. Yeah, perfect segue, Will, into the fact that one of the challenges here in figuring out kind of customer experience and marketing and sort of where the lines all stop is that not everyone's even working with sort of the same definitions in order to sort of think about how to align these disciplines. And that isn't just limited to definitions. It also then translates sort of into who perceives themselves to be responsible for what parts of the customer relationship and how all that should fit together. So one thing I want to make sure I convey here is that it's important for everyone to sort of get on the same page about what these definitions are and then use those more effectively when having the right conversation. So we'll start with the marketing definitions, or the brand definitions rather. And there are sort of three that I want to set out. So the first is that the brand is the collection of values, objectives, perceptions, and assets from which the company identity and strategy is built. Now, there's a lot of conversation that's happened over the last couple of years, particularly in light of how much influence people have on brand perception and brand view. And I've heard quite a few marketers who sort of say that the brand is whatever the customer says it is. And I pretty strenuously disagree with that take on what a brand is, because the brand certainly is influenced by the customer. There's the reason perceptions is in there is absolutely because the customer matters. But a company needs to sort of put a stake in the ground about who they are, who they want to be, relative to and for that customer. So that's how we think about the brand. And the brand strategy kind of follows as being a set of guidelines that ensures the business decisions and interactions reinforce and convey that brand promise. So that will apply to everyone, not necessarily those just within marketing or customer experience, but it can be extended into service, it can be extended into operations departments, sales, etc. So the strategy has to make sure that everyone kind of gets behind this brand and understands how they can contribute to it. And then lastly, you have the brand experience, which is the sum of all the impressions that a customer will have. And this is very important that it's with the brand one-way messaging, directly interacting, or in peer-to-peer types of conversations. So you may not, as a company or a brand, have control in all likelihood over all elements of the brand experience. You may be able to influence it. There may be connections that you have, but ultimately the brand experience is the totality of those interactions and how they all come together. And then if we think about the customer experience and how we define that, the customer experience has its own definition as well as the strategy that goes with it. So very simply, CX is the perception that your customers have of their interactions with your company. So it's how they are thinking about the way they interact with you, whether it's positive or negative. They, again, may be influenced by situations outside of the company's control, conversations that they've had, but this is how they view what they're doing directly relative to you. And then a customer experience strategy then, as it would logically follow, becomes the plan that defines the intended experience and guides the activities and resource allocation needed to deliver an experience that meets or exceeds customer expectations. So when you take those all together and then move into the marketing definition here, sort of where marketing fits in all of this, is that marketing is the processes and tactics with which expectations for the customer experience are set and brand messages are distributed. So in effect, marketing is not necessarily just sort of the mouthpiece only of all of the brand experience and all of those elements here, but it is sort of the internal and external voice of the brand, of communicating this and making sure that the expectations for interactions with the brand are appropriately set, and all of that is taking place effectively. So that kind of leads us to the conversation about how all of these things fit together. And right now, in short, that marketing sort of so far demonstrated lack of true empathy for the customer and customer experiences, sort of uncertain placement in the organization. Those two things can actually be fixed using sort of the same solution. And this is where senior marketers need to sort of step in and own the brand, the customer experience, and the marketing together. I'm going to talk about how that works a little bit sort of within the organization so you can see how those pieces fit together visually. So if you just look to the next slide there, I can actually show that out, sort of what that hierarchy looks like. So you start with the brand strategy, which then leads into the customer experience strategy. So we say the brand, and I think that's fine, but this may also be a corporate strategy that's closely tied to a brand identity. It's from the customer experience strategy that you then set the rules and parameters for all the operational departments. So marketing, sales, service, anyone else who may be directly involved here. And then what happens is that there's a feedback loop actually that connects what happens in sort of those external channels that are more customer facing back up to the folks in charge of the brand and then flowing through the customer experience strategy to make sure that that alignment is maintained, that there's consistency in all those types of experiences, whatever they may be, to make sure that those kind of things can kind of ultimately be refined. And part of the value here is that marketing in this context can then sort of, once they've set the expectation and working with their service and commerce functions, ultimately I think will be much more valuable contributors to achieving customer obsession when customer experience is their guide. So marketers will help shape the brand's North Star and accompanying messaging so that customers have a seamless experience across all the touch points that make up their life cycle. We'll talk about what that looks like in a little bit. But all of the operational groups can share this feedback up and make adjustments and share problems back and make sure that happens. But you can see that this actually gives, I think, operational elements a much more strategic function when they follow very naturally from the brand to the customer experience strategy and down into the day-to-day that they're responsible for. So when I mentioned sort of the total brand experience a little bit earlier, this is just one way to think about kind of the components that make up this total brand experience. So customer touch points can be anything from the website to the store, call center, product, social conversations, etc. These may be happening on owned media or owned platforms, or they may not. And then you also have brand exposures, which may be things that perhaps the customer doesn't interact with the company directly in this regard, but they're seeing things like ratings and reviews are contributing to them, or they're seeing an ad even though they're not necessarily taking direct action from it. So there's some sort of, again, sort of exposure to the brand happening here that aren't things that they're actually interacting directly with the company on or taking action on the company in a meaningful way. And it's all of this that sort of adds up to be the total brand experience that companies need to be concerned with, either influencing directly or helping to orchestrate against.
Great, and so at this point I'd like to introduce a Venn diagram, essentially because no webinar would be complete without one. But exploring, I think what was really useful about Corey's model there is it looked at the kind of components of customer experience, or the key touch points. I think that's one dimension, and another way that we look at this is looking at the organizational aspect, because quite frankly we know that large organizations often are so big and complex that there is an unfortunate siloing in corporate structures. And as I touched on earlier, I think what we feel at Brandwatch and what we see with some of our more sophisticated customers is that they're starting to use social insights to drive their understanding of customer experience in a much broader way than just in the sales and marketing blob. So if you have a look at this model, what this model is essentially trying to say is there are all sorts of opportunities throughout our organization to learn from this ginormous, renewing social insights petri dish that's available to us out there. So whether it's in product development, operations and distribution, customer service, business support, all of these functions potentially have really interesting opportunities to learn more. And we're going to pick up on some practical examples of that. One of our customers is in retail, and what the social analysis function in this particular organization, which is very, very big, well-known player in the US, what they do is they provide to over 200 people in the organization very precise insights from social that relate very closely just to a few numbers of products that the product manager or merchandiser or store manager is interested in. So it's not about insights into how the campaign is performing. It's not about how often is our brand being mentioned versus our competitor brands. And it's not about how is that particular crisis or troublesome issue going and what are people talking about. It is about how is this particular piece of furniture being talked about online? How are customers responding, and what kind of interesting, colourful, qualitative information are they giving about this piece of furniture? How can we provide that to the particular product manager who gets to make the business and merchandising decisions that can act upon it and genuinely improve it? So we're talking about SKUs, we're talking about real precision here and tailoring the queries so that the results are very, very useful to a handful of people rather than broad brush general information. One of our customers is one of the biggest banks in the USA, and what they've noticed, amongst other things, is that they typically find out about problems with their ATM network through the social web more quickly than they do through the internal channels that are the kind of official governed channels that relay information back and forth through the organization. So social data gives them a quickness that is very attractive to them. And this customer experience in a real-time world is a kind of fantastic opportunity and, as a double-edged sword, a challenge. And so it's really about encouraging organizations to think more broadly about how social data can help. What are the insights that go far beyond the marketing and comms department that can help drive service improvements that actually make a difference to customers' experience? And another way that organizations are taking advantage of this is also increasingly visualizing social data. So one of the opportunities available to those of you on the organization brand side is putting the voice of the customer, putting the customer experience in real time into the elevators, the lobbies, the C-suite, and most importantly, perhaps, the contact center. I think this is a fantastic example. You can Google for it. It's an Ad Age example about how Wells Fargo has a command center. And I think this theme of bringing customer experience to life by visualizing it is really powerful when we look at social. So back to you, Corey.
Perfect. So I mentioned this earlier, and I think those examples that Will just provided are great ones that sort of tee us up for the sort of last section around how to think about using marketing, customer experience, social insights, and all the other data that you have in a way that kind of brings everybody together. So rather than just thinking about sort of that customer experience triangle and those objectives, or particularly kind of those very traditional marketing objectives around making awareness and consideration. Instead, we want to think about this from the customer's perspective. So this is the customer life cycle, which essentially offers the company a view into the customer's behaviors around these 6 phases. So they discover, they explore, they buy potentially, although not always, which is important. They use the product, they ask questions about it, either directly to the company or to a community, and they also just engage with the company or, again, a community related to the company. But there's a lot of opportunity to connect with customers in each one of these phases. I mentioned sort of needs-based personas on the grounds that different needs take place, different needs manifest themselves in each one of these phases in meaningful ways. So we look at that a little bit more in depth of how we're thinking about the life cycle and how it can be used here, is that you want to think about this as the enterprise's view of the phases a customer passes through in the course of an ongoing relationship with the company. So you can think about this actually as a tool on 2 levels. One is sort of the more micro level, which could be more or less equated with like a path to purchase or sort of a decision journey related to a particular purchase, but also on the more macro level, which is that ongoing, more lifetime focused and extended sort of relationship view. And you want to bring both of those kind of together to understand this. So I want to talk through kind of what happens in each one of these phases to make it very clear. So for example, in the discover phase, you have customers being exposed to the initial trigger that will lead them to a new need or repeat purchase of an existing need. Now, this is not just a trigger that marketing put out. This is their own personal needs or wants. It may be an impulse buy, maybe something they think quite a bit about, but that trigger can be any number of things, and it's important to think about what those might be and where sort of the marketing fits into that. Then they potentially move into the explore phase, that they will be researching your brand or your product, but also their other options. And what's important to keep in mind here is that unlike the traditional marketing funnel where the funnel said that the consideration set narrows, in fact, for Explore, the consideration set gets wider when customers start to do this type of research. And so you need to think about what else they're being exposed to and what the right places are for your content and types of engagement to influence Explore in a meaningful way. The buy phase is pretty self-explanatory. It's when they go through the purchase process and complete the transaction. This can be in store, this can be online, this can be via a sales rep, the number of different ways that they can kind of complete this transaction. But this is all about what the buying process is like. And this is where marketing and commerce functions and also sort of back-end merchandising need to come together to make sure they're meeting the demand that they've set and fulfilling that part of the experience to this point in the life cycle. In use, the customer has sort of brought their new service or product with them, and they are starting to use it. So it includes initial and ongoing impressions of their purchase, and is perhaps, depending on the product, this can be very high consideration. Think about major investments or large technology products, for example, computers. People you can be using it all the time and thinking a lot about that. On the other hand, it could be things like their toothpaste. And so use is not an involved process at all. And so the sort of nuance there about where you potentially can play, how you can build out a product experience around use, there's a lot of really interesting questions that it can bring to the fore. In ask, this is the service phase. So they're reaching out to get service or help with a purchase. Again, this could take place directly with the company, but it also could just as easily be places they go to third party or to other options to get the information that they're looking for. And then lastly, you have the engage phase. Now, customers connect with brands for non-service reasons here. They do it across multiple channels, so social has a big role here as it does in several of these other phases. But you want to stay in touch with customers. There's value in sort of, again, that knowledge of and engagement with your customers. A huge source of that can sort of come post-purchase, not just treating the customer as someone who's bought or hasn't bought and then sort of letting them go on the merry way. There's a real value to closing this loop, recognizing that customers may very likely move from discover over to ask, and do all these phases out of order, and trying to get a better handle on that to understand how the experience will take place across each one of these for different customers is critically important. The role marketing plays in all of this is helping to build more relevant interactions. So as you go across that life cycle and you're looking for opportunities to engage, marketing needs to sort of spark what we would call an interaction cycle, where you take an interaction, then use that as an insight to help guide the next interaction. So to use every time a customer connects with you around the whole life cycle to make sure that you are playing a role in building those interactions, creating them in a way that sort of sparks this cycle so that the interactions connect with those insights and so on and so forth. And when that cycle sort of runs out, then marketing is there and prepared to jump back in and make those contributions all over again to use those insights more effectively. So the question that you need to ask yourselves here in order to create these interaction cycles is, do you have the data that you need to sustain the cycle? And that may be a question of technology. Do you have the right technology to capture and then process the data? Do you know where to look for it? Is there a way that you have to structure or make sense of unstructured data that may be coming in? Do you have the right processes in place? Are the people that need to know about customer interactions in the know about them? Can you get the information to them in a way that allows them to make adjustments and connect appropriately? So having the data isn't just a question of, is it out there, but is it usable? Are the right people able to use it? Do they have the processes they need, et cetera, in order to actually capture that and turn the interactions into those meaningful insights?
Lovely, and that's a fantastic kind of setup for me, because my interest in this area and Brandwatch is interested in this area is going beyond the areas where marketing is typically most comfortable. And so what I wanted to do is look at some practical examples in the segments of the Forrester customer lifecycle model that marketing typically wouldn't focus as much on, but are the kind of heartlands of customer experience, just to see what we can do in that area. I've taken 3 of those segments. We're going to look at buy to begin with. So typically, marketing is focused further up that cycle. But here we can see that by using a social analytics platform, we can find people who are literally on the cusp of, or who have literally just completed or recently bought the product or service. We set up, one of our data scientists, Dina, here at Brandwatch, set up some queries looking at the LG G2 phone. And these are publicly available tweets and Facebook updates that Brandwatch found. And you can see that these are people who are right at the point of purchase or have just bought. And this is a great opportunity for us to understand what that immediate reaction looks like. What is the customer's context in that moment? What were the key questions that they moved through? What are the emotions that they are currently expressing? And thinking about how we can learn from those and pass them on, as I said before, to the right people in the organization who are able to act on these insights. Just to get a little bit geeky here, we're not going to go into too much depth, but I thought for those of you who are using a social analytics platform on a day-to-day basis, you'd be interested in just a quick overview of how we set up the query here to find and isolate these particular mentions. So you can see that Dina, our data scientist, was looking for past tense of purchase and synonyms to that, so things like picked up or snapped up or paid for. And she's using the near operator to make sure that this appears really close to the brand name LG and the product name G2, and like the got or getting or about to and going to or pay for. And so, but she's avoiding the kind of spammy marketing promotions mentions. And so in this way, what Dina has set up is the ability for people whose only interest in the organization is people who've just recently bought, and to find the information that they would find interesting. The second example is use, which is the next aspect of that Forrester lifecycle model. And here we can see people who are now into their customer experience. So we have on the left-hand side some yays and some woohoos, and on the right-hand side, particularly the lower right-hand side, we've got a really unhappy customer who is now into their experience and is struggling because the product is letting them down. when I think about a large organization in particular, this is a different group of people internally who want to know this information. This is right into the heartland of customer service, of course. And then at a strategic level, it's also making sure that this kind of information feeds back. If you remember in Corey's model, she had that dotted line going back up into the strategy. It's feeding this back into merchandising decisions, supply chain decisions, product and service innovation, so that the loop is closed and all of this intelligence available from customer experiences, real customer experiences, is going back into a useful loop. And how you can see Dina set this up in Brandwatch is looking for emotions. So this is strong. There's a strong twist here, which is looking for emotional words, which to look for those personal experiences, and looking at pronouns. So I or me or myself. And then right near the bottom, putting the conversation into the context of the G2 specifically. So again, using the near operator, and that near 5 means that within 5 words of the previous part of the query, the LG or G2 is going to be appearing. And so in this way, again, segmenting a very kind of clear set of information for people internally. And then, as Corey mentioned, there's this ask segment to the lifecycle model. There's this moment where people are reaching out, either to the formal providers of support, like customer services, or, as Corey mentioned, to a community, peers, friends, expert forums. And you can see exactly that here. And again, to me, this is customer experience gold. It's helping us understand at scale and close to real time, what are the challenges that people have. And when we put our benefits hat on and we think about ROI, there's huge opportunities here around lowering the cost of customer service, and opportunities in nipping those issues in the bud through better product or packaging or support materials to directly drive a measurable return for the organization. So social media marketing is still to some extent plagued with questions about ROI. When I, as a marketer, look at this area, I think, hey, we can show ROI in this area. This is somewhere we can really step up and provide our organizations with insights that help them improve as a business. And the way, for those of you who are doing this on a day-to-day basis, the way that Dina set this up is looking for phrases that suggest that the product isn't working. So you can see words like power, switch, turn off, function, respond, and near words like dying, stuck, freeze, troubleshoot. And again, is able to really carefully isolate people who are at this exact point in the life cycle, rather than just everyone who is mentioning the brand. And I thought just quickly, it might be interesting to you as an audience to understand, just for this dummy query that Dina set up for the LG G2 handset, how the number of mentions split between those 3 kind of subsets. And you can see that it's interesting to me that the buy experience was still so much bigger than the other 2. So just in case that's interesting or useful to you guys. And so, in this way, I think what's really interesting about the Forrester model is thinking about it and thinking, how can social insights, how can we as people inside organizations, launch off some of these aspects and put together carefully tailored reports that help people in the business. So just quickly building to make sure that we finish on time. So Corey, over to you for some key takeaways.
Perfect. Yeah, I just have a couple here that just to summarize sort of where we've been and leave you with sort of some key elements that if you take nothing else away, that I hope you would remember. So the first is that brand marketing and customer experience are converging for both the customer and then by definition also for the business. And so it's essential to start figuring out how you as an organization are planning to make sure that those 3 elements are aligned, that you can deliver from all of those disciplines something that is consistent and holistic across the entire life cycle. So that's the first key takeaway to think about. The second one is to use the customer life cycle, or perhaps your own sort of derivation of it as relevant, as a framework that the whole organization can use to understand the customer. So every part of the business, by virtue of the fact that those phases touch every part of the business, should be aligned behind this and understand where their contributions play, whether it's behind the scenes across the whole life cycle. For example, if you're working in technology, there's elements of that across all of these different phases, Or perhaps that you are externally facing and you're in sales and you focus solely on the explore and buy phases, for example. But regardless, you want to have something that the whole company can understand is their view, shared view of the customer, and then align how they contribute to delivering a good experience around that together. And then the third takeaway here is that social data, as Will has illustrated, can provide really critical insight in each phase of the life cycle. And this isn't just for marketing, but can also be for other departments. So there's a real trove of information that can be leveraged here to help better understand that life cycle, inform other actions and types of engagements that you should be paying attention to as an organization because of their personal nature, because of how timely they typically are. They really fit well into this idea of sort of understanding the customer on his or her terms and engaging with them appropriately.
Brilliant. And so as we move towards finishing here, just inviting you to ask any questions that you have either on Twitter or in the chat box on the webinar. Thank you very much from Brandwatch.
So we'll move into our Q&A portion right now, and as Will said, if you have any, please feel free to funnel them through to us. So our first question is, does customer satisfaction really lead to purchase? How can better CX management contribute to clarity here? And Corey, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So just at a high level, we already know that companies with a very strong customer experience outperform the market by pretty significant numbers. So if you look at, for example, companies that score very well and perform very well in our evaluation of companies with strong customer experience, they outperform the S&P year on year by considerable margins. On the flip side of that, companies with poor customer experiences by our rating underperform the S&P. And this actually was a study that was done by a company that isn't Forrester to do this evaluation on sort of the financial implications here. It's not necessarily just a correlation between customer satisfaction and a specific purchase, but it's even bigger than that. It's the whole health of the business, and in terms of their finances, revenue, et cetera, stock margins, all of those different kind of considerations that we've looked at and others have looked at as well, that indicate that companies with satisfied, happy customers who are sort of meeting those three dimensions of the customer experience, that effective, enjoyable, easy, are showing really clear performance results as a result of having that strong CX.
And I would just jump in here. I'm not an expert in this area, but for me, the bigger picture is one where I know that a very large percentage of the decisions I make as a consumer are now driven or informed by the opinions of other customers. And I'm making really big decisions in some cases based on information provided by complete strangers. So of course there are caveats and bear traps in that land, but to me, from a bigger picture point of view, I just think it's a complete no-brainer in this networked age that we as customers are going to go with the organizations who other customers we trust advocate for. And I do believe there are a number of studies which make this point much more credible. One that springs to mind is the Edelman Trust Barometer, which talks about who do people trust, and I think that is just one aspect of this.
That's actually a pretty good segue into our next question, which is there one industry that might benefit more from than others from improved alignment between some of the functions that you've mentioned?
Sure. So I don't have specific numbers off the top of my head on this, but we have done quite a bit of the research on our customer experience team about which industries are performing well, kind of looking at these customer experience dimensions based on vertical. And there are companies that in particular that I think will benefit from the alignment are any organizations or verticals for that matter that have multiple departments or disciplines that touch or engage with the customer in one way or the other. So really diverse organizations that either through lines of business or just different channels and touch points interact with the customer particularly need that type of coherent strategy overarching, or else you're going to have too many people trying to do too many different things and sort of rowing in those opposite directions. So, your in-store experience needs to line up with your online experience, whatever that is and however you define it in accordance with the brand. But the more disparate types of ways the customer can interact, the more important it is to make sure that there is clear alignment, which often doesn't exist between those different elements of the overall journey.
And for me, I would say there are two areas that question takes me to. One is organizations which tend to be very large and very slow to move and are often in a regulatory or compliance environment. So I'm thinking particularly about financial services and, funnily enough, government as well. I think there are huge opportunities for those organizations to learn more about their customer experience and to do better. And then the other one, which is more of a positive opportunity rather than a negative one, is organizations which are in kind of fast-moving markets. So whether it's fashion or food and bev, where there's an opportunity to learn quickly and then drive those learnings back into the customer experience relatively quickly, I think a really exciting kind of positive opportunity to do this kind of learning more quickly about customer experience.
So we're just about at the top of the hour. So if you have any questions that we didn't get to, we will follow up with you offline. I want to thank Corey very much for her participation here today as our guest speaker.